What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Evil West, the supernatural meets Wild West action game that just recently released. However, to get my normal stuff out of the way first, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, and while that includes the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you are not subscribed and you go to my channel, the first thing you're going to see is a video explaining everything that I cover. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. But with that out of the way, let's actually dive into what this game is. So the first thing to understand about Evil West is that this is a sort of old school action game. It's a linear adventure where we move through various stages, fighting all sorts of, in this particular case, vampires, but the focus is the combat. The story is pretty basic, the exploration is very minimal, it's mostly just combat. And in that sense, it plays like a lot of the early God of War games, or in some cases, some of the more recent Doom games in terms of the way it approaches combat, which is definitely something to keep in mind. Now let's talk a little bit about the story. Obviously, the most simple, straightforward answer is that we play with a bunch of high-end tech fighting vampires through the Wild West. More specifically, we play as Jesse Rentier, who works as part of the Rentier Institute, an institute dedicated to hunting down vampires for the United States government. The situation with vampires and humans has reached a bit of a boiling point, with humans discovering technology every day that makes them a genuine threat to the existence of vampires, and many vampires have decided now is the time to fight back. Now, without spoilers, that's basically it. I would tell you the game brings up a few interesting plot points in the beginning, but then it quickly devolves into just cheesy one-liners and awful writing towards the end. Mostly it's just okay, and it gets really cheesy B-movie stuff towards the end. But luckily, the story's not the focus of this game, as it is decent at best. Though I will say, for what it's worth, the overall concept and the ideas of the sort of vampires versus humans in the Wild West era is actually pretty compelling. I think there could be more done with this than what we see in this game. But obviously, not much to do with this particular title. Now, from there, before we jump into the game a little bit, let's talk about difficulty and New Game Plus. So, difficulty in this game is, story, normal, hard, or evil. Evil being the hardest, and the primary difference between all of these is basically how much damage you take. However, as you play through the game, progress, gain all new weapons, etc., eventually you can hit New Game Plus. After you beat the game, you can enable New Game Plus, which basically just lets you play through the story again with current equipment. Not much else changes. And on subsequent New Game Plus playthroughs, where you have all of your upgrades, the higher difficulties are much easier to tackle. Though the primary difference between all of them is basically just how much damage you take and how much damage the enemies take. Though again, this is a situation where having all of your equipment and upgrades basically levels the playing field, but I would say most people are probably going to be able to find a decent challenge. You can also change the difficulty on the fly whenever, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much. From there, let's talk about a few of the progression systems that I mentioned. As we move through the game and we level up and collect currency, which is just US cash, we're going to be able to spend them on perks and upgrades, and also unlock weapons as we progress through the story, of course. But perks are pretty much what you'd expect. They upgrade your various abilities, allow you to do more, hit more things, and just generally be more powerful. Every time you level up, you will get one perk, and while you won't get all of them in one playthrough, on subsequent playthroughs you can get basically everything. And then we have our upgrades. Upgrades cost cold hard cash. Again, as you play the game and level up, more upgrades will be available to you, and you can spend the cash you are earning on these upgrades. Every time you level up, you get $2,000 in cash, in addition to whatever you pick up during the various levels. Upgrades are specifically for your weapons, and they make all the damage they deal much, much better. They can also give you a lightning version of your weapon, which is just, again, flat out better, as most of the enemies take increased damage from these things, and in some cases, this actually adds extra effects to the weapons as well. So overall, pretty decent system. It is worth mentioning for both perks and upgrades, though, that as you move through the game, you can find various chests that will actually unlock some of the perks and upgrades for you. So some of them are contingent upon you going and finding the appropriate chest in the appropriate level. But for the most part, fairly simple progression systems, as you would probably imagine for a game like this. Now from there, let's talk combat, the most interesting part of this game. Combat for this kind of feels like a mix of 2018's God of War and a little bit of the recent Doom entries. Now obviously we have a different coat of paint here, so visually it will look a bit different, but a lot of the core concepts you can see in those two games as well, and I would be surprised if they weren't some amount of inspiration for this. But we have a decent variety of weapons and a decent variety of ways to use them. For starters, you have a pistol, which will just quickly fire. You don't really aim it. You also have a proper rifle that you can aim appropriately and shoot various things both in the environment and in combat, of course, which plays a particularly big role in shooting weak points during an interrupt phase. Every once in a while, an enemy will do something and a spot will open up, and then you can aim and quickly shoot it, which will both interrupt their attack and usually weaken them in some way, while also generating a potential health pickup. As combat in this game is very fast-paced. Killing enemies, performing combos and things will drop pickups, which is more health for you, and there's a ton of movement and action involved as a result, but a lot of the really cool stuff is centered around your Rentier Gauntlet. This is the sort of unique contraption that makes humans able to fight vampires, and it's basically a lightning gauntlet. It's sort of your base attack, but also gets a ton of upgrades. A little ways into the game, you'll be able to block with it and start properly electrocuting enemies, which stuns them for a period of time and opens them up to various combos. As you do this, the gauntlet will charge energy that you can spend on various finishing moves that obviously deal increased damage. And then we have the Surge mode. Again, a bit into the game, you can eventually spend a lot of your gauntlet's energy to enter a Surge mode, which basically lets you just destroy everything until you're out of energy, which is a quick way to deal with difficult enemies, and it's a good bit of fun. Now, later on in the title, you also get access to a bunch of other weapons that are really fun, such as a Gatling gun, a stick of dynamite, a sort of crucifix that will both electrocute and stun all sorts of enemies around you. You also get a shotgun for close range, and you're going to be making use of all of these various weapons to appropriately counter enemies. As you might imagine, a lot of enemies are weak to a specific weapon, or are best approached with a specific weapon. And this is where the game starts to feel like the more recent Doom encounters, especially later in the game, where each particular combat encounter you enter has a variety of enemies that all need to be dealt with in a certain way, and it kind of feels like picking a puzzle apart, albeit a very fast-moving one. Though I do think it's worth mentioning that towards the end of the game, a lot of the combat encounters just become various forms of, here's a different combination of the mini-bosses you fought earlier, which isn't unheard of, but, gets a little after a while. Now, for the most part, I think this was a really fun combat system. The story's not trying too hard, but the combat's fun, and I can see the appeal of that kind of thing for people. Though I will say one thing that did hurt the combat for me was on PC. We'll talk about Steam Deck here in a minute, but on PC, I found that sometimes during combat, the controls would become unresponsive. And when this happens, the first thing I do is check my keyboard, mouse, make sure nothing's dying or failing, and verify that it's actually the game. And after doing that, it was definitely the game, and it seemed to happen the most when I was attempting to switch weapons. The game would just seem to decide that I didn't need to do that, and it wouldn't switch weapons, and it would cause me to run into various problems with the encounters because I can't switch to the weapon I need because the controls don't want to work, and that's probably the most significant tech problem I ran into. Though it is worth mentioning, I did get a consistent audio bug that was incredibly annoying and loud, because as you might imagine, with all the lightning-infused weaponry, a lightning sound effect plays somewhat regularly, and a few times it seemed to bug out and just would not stop playing, which was incredibly annoying. Other than that, though, the game was a relatively fun experience. From here, let's talk about Steam Deck compatibility a little bit. Honestly, I think this game was more fun for me on the Steam Deck specifically, because the controller issue just wasn't an issue. Where I would find controls to sometimes be unresponsive on PC, they worked perfectly on the Steam Deck. However, this game has a lot going on in terms of graphics and fast-moving things, so I did have to turn the settings to the game down to low to avoid any hiccups in the frame rate. But beyond that, the game of course has controller support, which feels very natural for a game like this, which also makes it a lot of fun to play on the Steam Deck. And thankfully, the relatively small screen, compared to say a PC or a TV, makes having to turn the graphics down less noticeable. And overall, I'd say there's a great case for this to be played on the Steam Deck in particular, because this is a game that can be played in relatively short bursts, and the combat's a lot of fun, which I think are things that work on the Steam Deck more so than a traditional PC. But that brings us to the positives, the negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So, positives for me are the fun combat, honestly. The combat is a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. It's visually very appealing. It's fast-paced. It's fun to engage with. The upgrades and progressions felt like they were paced out really well across what is, if you're watching all the cutscenes, about a a 10 to 12 hour experience. Which brings me to my other positive, and that was that this was a focused experience. I enjoyed that the game didn't try to do too much, honestly. As much as I would love to see something like this in a more bigger RPG open world game, at the end of the day, not every game needs to be like that, and this is a game that knew what it wanted to do and really refined the experience of that main thing, which the game does very well. However, there are a few negatives, of course. As I mentioned earlier, the writing for the story is pretty bad, in my opinion, especially towards the end where it's just awful. Like, I realize it wasn't the focus, but geez, it is not good. Now, I suppose some people could like it in that sort of cheesy B-movie kind of way, but I was not a fan. And then beyond that, we have the few bugs I mentioned, again, on PC with these unresponsive controls. That is setting you up for a bad time, and given its somewhat inconsistent nature, can make for some moments of real frustration. And then my other negative is replay value, actually. So they let you New Game Plus, of course, to run through the game again, but the fact that a game like this doesn't have a mission select feature is crazy to me. They let you play it in co-op, which I guess is nice, but I don't really see playing a game like this in co-op because there's nothing else to support it. There's no like alternate game modes or anything. You're just playing through the story with someone, and the story is super short. Because of that, probably my biggest negative for this game is that there's just not a lot of content here, and yet they're charging full AAA price. Which brings us to our conclusion. My conclusion for Evil West is this. It's a good game. It's not great. It's not amazing. It's not going to blow your expectations out of the water, but it's good. I enjoyed it. The combat is fun. Because of that, purely on a gameplay experience, I think it's worth checking out. However, that runs up against the problem of the price of this game. This is going to be a 10 to 12 hour experience for most people, and they want AAA money for it. It's like $50 on PC and then weirdly more on consoles from what I hear. And while the game is fun and all, I just simply couldn't recommend this to someone for that price. This is something I would have expected more in the $20, $30 range, with $40 pushing it. And seeing how I did actually pay for this game, I did not get a review copy. This is something I paid for. I don't feel great about having paid $50 for this particular title, fun as it may be. So there you guys go. There is my review for Evil West. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.